Dr. Ethan Reynolds stepped out of Memorial Hospital's sliding glass doors into the crisp autumn air, his scrubs still bearing the evidence of his 18-hour shift. Coffee stains marked his sleeve where a trembling hand had missed his mouth hours earlier. A smudge of something darker, blood perhaps, decorated his left knee from when he'd knelt beside the gurney of a motorcyclist who wouldn't see tomorrow. His surgical cap was stuffed hastily into his pocket, his dark hair disheveled from running his fingers through it too many times during the night. The parking lot lights cast harsh shadows across the empty spaces. 3 a.m. was that peculiar time when even the busiest hospital seemed to catch its breath, when the night shift was fully engaged, but the frenetic energy of the day had faded. Ethan welcomed the momentary stillness. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind still raced, cataloging patients, remembering details, wondering if he'd made the right calls. That's when he heard it. A soft, barely perceptible whimper. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, a trick of exhaustion playing on his senses. But then it came again, more distinct this time. Ethan looked around, squinting in the dim light, and spotted a small shape near the curb, partially hidden beneath a parked car. His step quickened. As a trauma surgeon, Ethan was programmed to move toward distress, not away from it. As he approached, the shape revealed itself. A puppy, no more than a few months old, lying motionless on the cold pavement. "Hey there," Ethan whispered, crouching down. The puppy was small, a mix of some kind with wiry brown fur and oversized paws that spoke of growth yet to come. Its eyes, half closed, tracked weakly toward Ethan's voice. One of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle. A trail of blood, dark and alarming, seeped from a wound on its side. Something inside Ethan, something that had held steady through the grueling shift, through the motorcyclist's death, through the notification of yet another family that their loved one hadn't made it, finally broke. He sank to his knees and covered his face with his hands, a sob escaping before he could contain it. His shoulders shook with the force of it. 18 hours of tragedy and tension finding release in this moment, triggered by this small, broken creature. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was apologizing to, the puppy, himself, or all the patients he couldn't save that day. "I'm so sorry." The puppy whimpered again, softer this time, as if offering comfort rather than seeking it. Ethan lowered his hands and wiped roughly at his eyes. "Okay," he said, his voice steadier. "Okay, let's see what we've got here." With gentle hands, the same hands that had held a human heart just hours before, he carefully examined the puppy. The leg was definitely broken, but it was the laceration on its side that worried him most. The bleeding was slow but steady, suggesting internal damage. The puppy's breathing was labored, its small ribcage rising and falling with visible effort. "Who did this to you, buddy?" Ethan murmured, though he suspected he knew the answer. The location, near the busy intersection at the hospital entrance, told its own story. Hit and run, most likely. Just like the motorcyclist. Just like too many others. He made a quick decision. Unbuttoning his white coat, he created a makeshift cradle. "This might hurt a bit," he warned, slipping his hands beneath the small body with the practiced care of someone used to handling fragile things. The puppy whimpered as Ethan lifted it, but made no attempt to struggle. "I've got you," Ethan promised, cradling the small form against his chest as he strode back toward the hospital. "I've got you." The employee entrance to the veterinary clinic was exactly where Google Maps had indicated, down a narrow alley behind the main building. Ethan shifted the puppy's weight in his arms, using his elbow to press the buzzer. The night was growing colder, and adrenaline had replaced his earlier fatigue. No answer came. He buzzed again, longer this time, then a third time with increasing urgency. Finally, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Riverside Emergency Vet. We're closed. Regular hours begin at—" "I have an injured puppy," Ethan interrupted. "Hit by a car. Probable internal bleeding. Compound fracture of the rear left femur. I'm Dr. Reynolds from Memorial. Please, I need help." A pause, then, "Give me a minute." True to the promise, 60 seconds later, the door swung open to reveal a woman in blue scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her eyes, despite the hour, were alert and assessing. "Dr. Winters," she said by way of introduction, her gaze already on the bundle in Ethan's arms. "Bring him in." She led the way through a darkened waiting room and into a back area that mirrored the layout of Ethan's own emergency department, albeit on a smaller scale and configured for four-legged patients. "Here," she indicated an examination table. "Tell me what you know." Ethan gently laid the puppy down. "Found him in the hospital parking lot about 20 minutes ago. No collar, no visible identification." His clinical training took over, pushing his earlier emotional breakdown aside. "Respiration labored, pulse weak but regular. The fracture is obvious, but I'm more concerned about this laceration. Based on location and depth, I suspect damage to the spleen, possibly the liver." Dr. Winters was already examining the puppy, her movements efficient and practiced. "Good assessment. You said you're a doctor?" "Trauma surgeon." She glanced up, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "That explains the detailed report. Different species, same problems, huh?" "Blood is still blood," Ethan agreed, watching as she checked the puppy's gums. "He's in shock," she confirmed. "We need to stabilize him before addressing the leg." She reached for a drawer and began preparing an IV line with the same fluid efficiency Ethan recognized from his own best nurses. "You've brought him to the right place, but I should warn you, treatment isn't cheap, especially emergency surgery like this will require." The implication was clear. No collar, no owner present, this was a stray, and Ethan was now the closest thing to a responsible party. "I'll cover it," he said without hesitation. Dr. Winters nodded, continuing her work, but Ethan caught the slight relaxation in her shoulders. "Do you have a name for him? It helps with the paperwork." A name. Ethan hadn't considered that. He looked down at the small creature fighting so hard to stay alive. In those brown eyes, despite the pain, he saw a familiar determination. "Leo," he said. "His name is Leo." Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow. "After someone?" "My brother," Ethan said quietly. "He was a fighter too." She didn't press for details, and he was grateful. Instead, she focused on inserting the IV catheter into Leo's small vein, a task that required both precision and gentleness. "I'm going to need to take him back for imaging and possible surgery," she said, securing the line. "There's a waiting room through that door. I'll come find you when we know more." Ethan hesitated, suddenly reluctant to leave the puppy, Leo, behind. "Could I—" He stopped, feeling foolish. He wasn't family. He wasn't even an owner. He was just a stranger who'd found a wounded animal. Dr. Winters seemed to understand. "We'll take good care of him," she promised, "and I'll give you updates as soon as I can." Ethan nodded, finally stepping back. "Thank you." In the waiting room, reality began to assert itself. What was he doing? He'd just committed to potentially thousands of dollars in veterinary care for a stray dog. He had student loans, a mortgage, and barely enough time to care for himself, let alone a pet. It was impulsive, irresponsible even. He rubbed his eyes, the weight of exhaustion returning now that the initial crisis had passed. He should call someone, Miranda perhaps. His sister would know what to do. She always did. But a glance at his watch showed it was nearly 4 in the morning. Too late, or too early, to wake her, especially with a 5-year-old in the house. Instead, he leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair and closed his eyes, just for a moment. Ethan sits in another waiting room. Hospital-grade beige with magazine-strewn tables and the ever-present scent of disinfectant. The clock on the wall reads 3:17 a.m. His clothes smell of smoke and his hands still tremble slightly, though whether from cold or shock he can't tell. The door swings open. His parents look up. His father's usually stoic face now ashen. His mother's eyes red-rimmed from crying. The doctor's expression tells them everything before he speaks. "I'm very sorry." Ethan doesn't hear the rest. His mother's wail drowns out the words, a sound he will never forget, the sound of a heart breaking. His father's strong arms encircle her, but he too seems to have shrunk, diminished in an instant. 22 years old. That's all Leo got. 22 years of life. Snuffed out by a fire in a rundown apartment building with faulty wiring and no working smoke detectors. Someone touches his shoulder. It's the doctor. Different from the one who spoke to his parents. Younger. Kinder, somehow. There was nothing more we could have done, the doctor says quietly. His injuries were too severe. Ethan nods, numb. He saved 3 people, the doctor continues. The family in apartment 4B carried their little girl out himself, then went back for the parents. That's courage. Courage. Yes, that was Leo. Always the brave one. Always the protector. While Ethan studied and planned, Leo lived and loved and leapt without looking. He remembers me, Ethan said, surprised. Alex smiled. Dogs are excellent judges of character. They know who helps them. Ethan crouched down, opening the kennel door carefully. Leo made a valiant effort to rise, but couldn't manage it with the cast on his leg and the weakness from surgery. Stay, buddy, Ethan soothed, reaching in to stroke the soft head. You don't need to get up for me. Leo settled, but his tail continued its weak wagging. He looked so much smaller in the daylight, so much more vulnerable. Yet there was something unmistakably vital about him, too. A resilience that resonated with Ethan. When can he leave? Ethan asked. Alex leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Medically speaking, probably in 3 to 4 days, assuming no complications, but that raises the question of where he'll go. It was the moment of decision. The rational part of Ethan's brain, the part that had gotten him through medical school with honors, that managed complex surgeries and made life-or-death decisions daily, was screaming caution. A dog was a decade-plus commitment. His hours were impossible. His apartment barely fit him, let alone a pet. There were shelters, rescue organizations, people better equipped than he was. But then Leo licked his hand, a gesture so simple and trusting that it bypassed all rational thought. He'll come home with me, Ethan said, the decision suddenly obvious. I'll make it work. Alex didn't look surprised. I thought you might say that. In which case we should talk about post-operative care, physical therapy options, and how to puppy-proof your place. I have a lot to learn, Ethan admitted. You do, she agreed. But learning is part of the deal, isn't it? With any new relationship. There was something in her tone, a warmth, perhaps, or just the acknowledgement of a shared understanding. That made Ethan look up. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, connection flashed between them, immediate and unexpected. Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. I really appreciate your help, all of it. She smiled. That's what we do, right? The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Ethan had never been more grateful for his accumulated vacation days, or for the sympathetic ear of the chief of surgery when he explained the situation. Take the week, Dr. Harrison had said. You've got the time, and frankly, Reynolds, you look like hell. When was the last time you took an actual break? Ethan couldn't remember. That's what I thought. Consider it doctor's orders. Get some rest, take care of your dog, and come back when you don't look like one of the patients. With that unexpected blessing, Ethan threw himself into preparations. His apartment underwent a transformation. Puppy gates appeared, electrical cords were hidden, a plush dog bed took up residence in the corner of his bedroom. Miranda arrived with Noah in tow, bearing supplies and unsolicited advice. You're insane, she told him cheerfully, as Noah raced around the apartment, testing the puppy gates. But in a good way. It's about time you had something in your life besides the hospital. It's not like that, Ethan protested. He needed help, and I was there. Miranda raised an eyebrow. So did every stray animal you've ever encountered, but I don't see your apartment full of rescues. This one's different. Before Ethan could argue further, Noah came barreling back, eyes wide with excitement. Can I meet him tomorrow? When you bring him home? Please, Uncle Ethan? I promise I'll be super gentle. Of course you can, Ethan agreed, ruffling the boy's hair. He'll need friends. "I'll be his best friend," Noah declared solemnly. After they left, Ethan stood in the middle of his transformed living room, surrounded by evidence of a decision that still didn't feel quite real. Was he really doing this? Becoming responsible for another life when he could barely manage his own? His phone pinged with a text. It was from Alex. Leo had a good day. Eating well, tolerating physical therapy, still on track for discharge tomorrow. She'd been sending these updates daily, though he'd also been visiting each afternoon. The messages were professional, informative, but they'd also begun to include photos. Leo with his head tilted quizzically at the camera, Leo napping with his cast propped on a small pillow, Leo making what could only be described as a doggy smile at the vet tech. "Thanks for the update," Ethan replied. "Everything's ready here." A pause then. "You sure about this?" It was a valid question, the same one he'd been asking himself, but seeing it from someone else, someone who'd witnessed his impulsive decision from the beginning, made him consider it more deeply. Was he sure? He wasn't sure of anything except that when he'd found Leo lying broken on the pavement, something long dormant had awakened in him, something that needed healing as much as the puppy did. "I'm sure," he texted back. "See you tomorrow." Bringing Leo home was a more emotional experience than Ethan had anticipated. The puppy seemed to understand that something significant was happening. He sat quietly in Ethan's lap during the car ride, those intelligent brown eyes taking in everything, occasionally looking up as if for reassurance. "Almost there, buddy," Ethan told him. "Your new home." The first evening was an exercise in patience and adjustment. Leo was still weak, still learning to navigate with his cast. He needed help eating, drinking, going outside. But his spirit was indomitable. He wagged his tail at every small victory, licked Ethan's hand whenever he came close enough. By the time they settled for the night, Leo in his new bed, Ethan on the floor beside him, unwilling to leave the puppy alone in a strange place, Ethan was exhausted, but filled with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. Just before drifting off, his phone lit up with a text. "First night going okay?" It was Alex. "So far, so good," he replied. "He seems comfortable." "And you?" The question caught him off guard. "Getting there," he answered honestly. "It gets easier. And harder. And then easier again. But it's worth it." "Are we still talking about the dog?" he dared to ask. Her response came after a pause. Maybe not entirely. "Good night, Ethan." He fell asleep smiling, one hand resting lightly on Leo's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of the puppy's breathing. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to Ethan's life. Morning walks, or carries in Leo's case until the cast came off, carefully measured meals, physical therapy exercises that Alex had demonstrated. The follow-up vet visits became something Ethan looked forward to, and not just because of Leo's progress. Work resumed, but something had shifted. Ethan found himself setting boundaries he'd never enforced before, leaving on time more often than not, saying no to extra shifts unless absolutely necessary. "You seem different, Doctor," Harrison commented one day, after Ethan had successfully performed a challenging aortic repair on a car accident victim. "More present." Ethan considered this. "I think I am. Having something to go home to changes your perspective." The chief nodded. "About time you figured that out. Some of us have been worried about you, Reynolds. The way you throw yourself into the work. It's admirable, but it's not sustainable." "I'm learning that," Ethan admitted. Dr. Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Now go home to that dog of yours. We've got things covered here." At home, Leo's recovery continued to exceed expectations. The cast came off. The physical therapy progressed from basic movements to actual play. The scared, injured puppy blossomed into a confident young dog with boundless curiosity and affection. Noah became a regular visitor, his delight in Leo's antics bringing a new level of joy to Ethan's apartment. And if Alex sometimes joined them for coffee after a checkup, or suggested a walk in the park to assess Leo's mobility that somehow turned into dinner afterward. Well, that was just part of the recovery process. For all of them. He's completely recovered, Alex said, settling beside him. You'd never know what he went through. Ethan nodded, pride swelling in his chest. He's amazing. Resilient. Like his owner, Alex said quietly. Ethan turned to look at her, at this woman who had somehow become an integral part of his life. First as Leo's doctor, then as a friend, and now as something still evolving, still undefined but full of possibility. I wasn't, he admitted. Resilient, I mean. Not before Leo. I was just existing. Because of your brother? He told her about Leo, the original Leo, one night over dinner. The story spilling out with surprising ease after years of keeping it closely guarded. Partly, his death. It gave me purpose, but it also trapped me. He squeezed Alex's hand. From you. She smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had first caught his attention in the pre-dawn hours of the veterinary clinic. We're all learning together, I think. Leo arrived, panting happily, and dropped a slobbery ball at their feet. His intelligent eyes moved between them, as if understanding the importance of the moment he'd interrupted. What do you think, Leo? Leo, now sprawled contentedly at their feet, had taught him that. In saving the puppy, Ethan had, in some inexplicable way, begun to save himself, and in the process, had opened his heart to possibilities he'd never imagined, to companionship, to joy, to a future that extended beyond hospital walls. It wasn't a perfect healing. There would still be difficult days, still be losses that cut deep. But now, Ethan knew he wouldn't face them alone. Now, he had reasons to come home. As if reading his thoughts, Alex leaned against his shoulder. Ready to go? Yeah, Ethan said, giving Leo's leash a gentle tug. The dog rose immediately, pressing close to his side, a warm, living reminder of that night.